Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, a.k.a. UberBear, and I'm joined today by my other host and my other host,
Christian Anderson.
And Stu. And today, we've got a special one because it's that spook time of year. It's October, and just around the corner is what?
Halloween.
And what better thing to talk about in Halloween than
CubeCon! Because we're at CubeCon right now and we're enjoying ourselves, and we have, at this point, this is day 1.5 of CubeCon, and we have drafted with 8 people, my cubes, that have never, ever even seen that many people sitting at the table. 6 drafts at this point. It has been amazing. And as we said before, it is the Halloween season. So since it is such season, we're going to do our special episode on UberBear's Horror Cube, which is a gothic horror inspired cube. We're going to use a little bit of a blasé here. It's Lovecraftian. Guy's a jerk.
yes,
but we'll go Cthulhu style, right?
Yes.
We're going to remove him from our said. We're not giving praises in this situation. But then we're going to give praises to others such as Stephen King.
Yep.
Clive Barker.
Clive Barker,
Hellbound Heart. It is Hellraiser is what it later became.
And one of my favorites as well is a guy named David Gemmell. I'm not sure how, I don't know if it's a guy that you're familiar with, but incredibly talented. And I think his writing kind of fits the theme of this cube with like the fantastical creatures and stuff like that. Very cool. So, as we do on the UberCube podcast with refreshments, let's talk about the refreshments. Anthony, what you got for us today?
This time I have a Rheingeist, a Mathlete. I don't know what's going on with this beer. It's a low-cal IPA. It's absolutely delicious. What have you got, Christian?
I also have a Rheingeist, but it is the Vision. It's a West Coast style IPA.
And I am going to be drinking a Crystal Lake Brewing Golden Lager, and it's the Beach Blonde, if you will.
All right, let's kick this episode off. We're gonna lead this off with a quote. As we said, we're at CubeCon. It's that time of season. We're enjoying ourselves, but we want this to be spooky because we're gonna be talking about UberBear's Horror Cube, which is gothic horror inspired. And what we're gonna cover in this particular episode is how we design it kind of from top down aspect. I'm gonna kind of give you the formulaic way of doing it. We're gonna call it very Innistrad, but Innistrad Plus is kind of the thematic build of this idea. And I personally love these unique builds. They force the curator to challenge themselves a little bit more because you want to try to not fall into that vampires versus zombies, locking horns, no one going over the battlefield type of situation. So it forces the curator to try to find unique situations and unique playstyles that can kind of break those, the doldrums of magic where, 2 creatures is like a football field with lineman versus lineman, if you will, right? So we're going to kick this off with a unique, spooky quote, and it's from Stephen King. And no one escapes from life alive. That's I had to process that for a little while. That one's a little rich. What do you?
I also heard it kind of similar, but don't take life too seriously. No one gets out alive.
Except for taxes and debt. All right. So let's move into let's break it down. So we're going to be focusing on UberBear's Horror Cube. This will all be included in the show notes. There'll be images included, etc. And what we're going to talk about is the approach that our team here likes to use. It's a very thematic, top-down design approach. Meaning we come up with the idea and then we build completely downwards. We don't let the cards necessarily drive us so much as the idea, if you will. I've set within this particular cube restrictions as to what art requirements. It has to be scary. It has to be horrifying. Or it has to have some kind of quote that makes it awful. Even down to and I do in this case have the P word for particular lands that we don't use here on the podcast, but we've basically made unique custom art to represent your traditional fetch lands, AV duels, etc. But every one of them have a scary quote and scary art that kind of really creates the vibe for this cube, if you will. It is, we're going to call it as power max as I can do it, but not to overstep. There was a point in the recent history where I overstepped that. And it's easy to do as a curator, where I wanted to have the Entombs, the Force of Negations, the Grizzlebrands, the Emrakul Promised End, etc. But it got me really thinking that was just not in the spirit, quote unquote, the spirit of what I was attempting to do with this cube. And like I said, I didn't want it to be 2 football teams just locking helmets. I wanted it to have a unique style and flavor to it, but how do you do that? How do you break over that? So you dive into some unique, interesting ideas. So the pitfall and that's what kind of happens with tribals is how do you take werewolves and humans, etc., and find tribal synergies that don't feel like they just play within their own unique, special, subgroup, right? You want your humans to cross-pollinate with your vampires in the same deck, and you want them to form an aggro deck or maybe an aristocrats deck or whatever. And you can actually be surprisingly challenging to do because there are limitations to what this creature. A lot of them are smaller. We'll use the vampires, for example. They're typically smaller on their power and toughness. And that creates just the idea of, well, what do I have to do? I have to find something unique abilities. I can't just put like a vanilla vampire in there that turns sideways. I want something that does like an aristocrat's theme or something. So I'll give you kind of the breakdown and then I'll explain the rationale behind it. Interestingly enough, prominently, a lot of times these cubes, in my case, will have a lot of black in it. But I've been very intentional with my choices of black cards within said cube. I have exactly 13 more black cards than I do every other. Yeah. Triskaidekaphobia. Spookiest. Triskaidekaphobias. Yeah. And I just thought it was fun. So tribal synergies is why, and I'll talk about this. There's 63 humans, but that's actually a crossover between werewolves, some spirits or later become spirits, and or like, I don't know, warriors or knights or whatever. They kind of fill that void. And then you got 24 werewolves. Again, that kind of bleeds over into the idea. And then we have 29 zombies, but there's more past that, or else they have zombie production like Giss's Bidding, etc. Or 21 spirits, 32 vampires. In that design or those parsing of that, I did it based on, if this makes sense, I did it based on the quantity that it require to be in that situation. So I think of the zombie horde, if you will, right? So there's going to be a large volume of them. They're going to be dumb, dragging their legs type thing. And they're going to be masses of them. Whereas I see the vampires as kind of the nobility, the aristocrats, if you will. They're pompous and pretentious and they're feeding upon their prey. And the humans are going to be a combination of those who have chosen to fight and those who have chosen to flee and those who are choosing to join. Yeah. Exactly. So that's going to be a culmination of like warriors and clerics and just peasants and plain old humans, right? Bob from the grocery store with a bag of apples running because there's werewolves coming up the street. The other one will turn, and then you got Jack and Sally turns around and just grabs the battle axes. It's completely different. So it's kind of the thought process I did with that. And then going back to the vampires, they're going to be overly confident. They're going to be ego-driven creatures. Ego. So when I did the dispersion of these, I didn't do this completely balanced environment. I did it based on what I thought, I guess, the socio layout of what those different parties or tribes would equal.
As Anthony has previously mentioned, there's a bunch of custom lands. They got the fetches, the shocks, the duels, and they all have some kind of spooky quote on there. From Clive Barker, Stephen King. Anthony even made up some of himself. And I mean, if you get the chance to draft this, you just want to take a second and read some of those quotes. It's pretty interesting and fun.
Yeah, I actually found during our recent draft, which was amazing, people were passing on the cards, and I became the distraction at the table and go, "That's pretty sweet. Have you read the quote at the bottom of that? That I wrote that. That's pretty sweet. Yeah. He didn't make it." All right. Supported archetypes within this cube are going to be like your self-mill, spider spawnings, Lab Maniac, Thassa Oracle, or Jace Wielder of Mysteries. And in that, I've actually done a custom art for Thassa's Oracle because I felt like the particular merfolk that represented that was a little too happy, bubbly rainbow for the environment I was trying to create. Like the art that I've chosen is either because it's horrific or these people are war weary. I mean, this is not a happy place. This is not a tourist destination. So no one's going to be out diving for pearls in this story. So it's kind of that thematic build that I'm wanting to represent. And I want it to be spooky. In addition to, I've got Reanimator. We're going to be doing casting cards like Entomb, which is OP, or Necromancy, or Reanimate. But your targets are actually going to be like Tovalar's Huntmaster, or it's going to be Grave Titan, or any kind of utility piece you want to bring back. At one point in this cube's environment, I was representing cards, like I said before, that were just too strong. It was the Emrakuls, it was the Grizzlebrands. And by the way, I've cut all the angels. They were just too happy. I mean, even though they were horrific, they were happy.
You can see why with something like Grizzlebrand, though, right? How much of an easy trap it would be to drop something like that in there. You know, if you've got a Reanimate package, then Grizzlebrand, I mean, we've talked in previous episodes about Archon of Cruelty and about how that's, you know, sort of taken over the reins. But Grizzlebrand is a scary-looking card, and it's very powerful in Reanimate. So definitely it's thematic, and yes, it's high-powered, but you still got to be really cognizant of where you want that power level to lie. But at the same time, it's got to be so difficult to not want to, you know, just keep a card like that in there because it's scary and it's powerful and it's fun.
Yeah, I was falling into the trap with this cube. Was with the first one. I was kind of doing a breakout, and I was trying to power max a little bit too much. The more I added cards to it, the more I tried to power max. And what I realized is I was actually ejecting the fun from the cube by trying to I was trying to replicate my 540 powered vintage experience a little bit too much. And as a curator, I was losing focus on what mattered to this cube. It was the fun and the appeal of the actual tribes that they represented and what they could do. And then, so I decided to get rid of the angels and the demons. And the others may come back in, but the Avacens and all those things, I was following the Innistrad storyline. But then I started thinking about it. Those weren't great stories really anyways. They kind of broke away from the gothic horror theme that I wanted to represent in the cube environment. Another major archetype that it's a fan favorite of mine is aristocrats. So I've got the blood artists and et cetera that support that idea, whereas I don't have the Zula ports. It had to be thematic, but it also had to feel like it came from Innistrad, but it's not completely based on the plane. I just felt like some cards overstepped it, so then I tried to find substitutes in that vampire aristocrat, et cetera. So I run a traditional spells matters type theme in here as well. It's actually not too hard to do. I mean, is it spells matters kind of just naturally comes together anytime you're running a kind of counterbalance, et cetera, lightning bolt. It's going to happen, but it is in here, and I do have cards that support it and get payoffs off of that. And then the traditional control mid-range aggro, those sub-archetypes and abilities, the pacing of those change based on the environment. They scale with the environment. So when someone recently asked me, what is your aggro set in here? It's not your traditional like Savannah Lions turning sideways. It's going to be some kind of vampire that's just faster than everything else in the cube. All right, we're going to move over to kind of discuss. We have a sub-category we want to talk about. It's going to be on Lords. And we talked about this recently with May in the Fey Cube episode.
First Lord, I really love. It can just be a beating. It's Micaeus the Lunarch. It's 1 white and X. It will enter in with X 1/1 counters on it, and then that will be its power and toughness. And then you can tap it and then put 1 counter on Micaeus, or you can tap it and then remove a counter and put 1/1 counter on all other creatures. You want to talk about beating? It can either be beating itself, or you can slow roll it and then just build your army up and then just smash face.
Yeah, the counter distribution can get out of control. What we talked about when we talked about the Fey Cube is the difference between an anthem type of Lord versus a utilitarian Lord. And when I say utilitarian, it's going to give some kind of added benefit that goes outside of creatures get +1/+1, creatures get +2/+2, etc. Anthems, right? The problem with traditional lords that are of a tribe is they don't always cross over into the other tribal aspects. So if you have a vampire that says all vampires get +1/+1, that literally does nothing for the 2 zombies you have in your hand. It makes it not necessarily a dead card, but it makes it a standalone card that's only going to prop up most of your army. So when I chose these creatures using Micaeus the Lunarch as an example, if you're in that white, it's going to distribute those counters across all your creatures, and it's agnostic as to what tribe it's in. But we're going to call it a lord because of the benefit it's adding. Stu, do you want to cover this next one?
All right, so I'm going to talk about Hordewing Scarb. This is a 4 colorless, 1 blue for a zombie horror creature. It has flying. It gives other zombies you control flying. And whenever 1 or more zombies you control deal combat damage to 1 or more of your opponents, you may draw cards equal to the number of opponents dealt damage this way. And if you do, discard that many cards. So you're definitely doing a whole bunch of filtering here, definitely getting the opportunity to fill your graveyard. So you can already see where some strategies are going to start to cross over in this. Demir being a reanimate. Hey, I want to pair this with some black cards. As you said, not really sort of vibing with the madness too much, but it's got some great utility for it.
Yeah, so it serves the purpose of being a lord for the zombie tribe, but at the same time, it's more than capable of being a standalone creature that's going to do a bit of looting for you, if you will.
All right, next we have another zombie lord, the other Micaeus, the black one. It's Micaeus the Unhowled. It's 3 generic and 3 black for a 5/5 with Intimidate. And it has whenever a human deals damage to you, destroy it. Other non-human creatures you get +1/+1 and have Undying. This will just wreck your board wipe if you have a board wipe out, and all the creatures are coming back. Bigger.
Yeah, and considering the fact that the humans are one of the largest tribes in here, and they cross over both into the traditional humans, but some of the werewolves, etc., this is a great reanimator target. If you do get it on the board, you get it on earlier. It does cost a lot. There are a lot of pips in here. My intentions is obviously either you're mono black and you're ramping into it, which is less traditional, but I do support a heavy black system here. Whereas normally Reanimator would be your actual way to go with this. And once you got this out, this is a threat on board that will make your zombies, etc., cut down the humans. And human tribals actually, and I believe this is true in a lot of cubes, it's exceptional So you have to have some kind of counterbalance for it. So this gives the zombies and the unfortunate werewolves and the vampires a chance to fight against the human tribe.
I would agree, and you know what? I'm not too sad about getting a dark ritual out pretty quickly and getting this out. Like, you know, card like that might typically be a combo piece, and yeah, sure, you're going to use ramp like that, or you're going to use rituals like that in order to either, you know, go off in a storm-based way or try and, you know, from an acceleration perspective, getting a creature like this out really early and giving your non-human creatures undying.
So the two Micaias, what they represent for me as a curator for a horror cube, is the juxtaposition between the living and the dead. Micaias the Lunarch represents the humans that are alive and they're thriving, but they're becoming withered. And then Micaias is whenever they become completely overwhelmed and subdued at this point. I love these two as just benchmarks, even though the pips on both ends can be a little exhausting, whereas Micaias the Lunarch does cost 1 planes plus X. You have to extend it, and it can be long-winded. The other one costs triple pip. These two cards are just pivotal to the storytelling that I'm attempting to do as the curator for this cube. All right, so we're going to move over a few more lords here. And some of these, I'm not going to go into great detail on, but Emerwolf. It's the wolf that makes it so your non-human werewolves you control can't transform, and it buffs your werewolves and your wolves. Then we have Droskul Captain that gives your other spirits hexproof and +1/+1. That is the weakness of that, is that it itself is actually vulnerable to attack, but it does protect your spirit army, which are traditionally smaller creatures like lingering souls, etc. Then we have the Diagraph Captain, and it's going to be a zombie that has death touch, and it's actually a traditional zombie captain as well. So I am kind of breaking the old statement that I made in the beginning, but I am very careful not to overly saturate lords in this environment. And I do believe that in a tribal, like we said before, in a tribal cube, it is easy to fall in the trap that I'm going to have 5 of these lords and 5 of those lords and 5 of those lords in different tribes, merfolk, goblins, zombies, humans, whatever. But you have to be cognizant that they don't necessarily cross-pollinate over into the other tribes. But I do like the idea of having some of these guild positions to be utilitarian spots that represent signposts for those particular tribes, but you don't want to overly saturate them because they become dead cards on draw if you go outside of the spectrum of, say, zombies, werewolves, humans, etc.
In Diagraph Captain, it also has that kind of aristocrat ability on there. It says whenever another zombie you control dies, it does a target opponent loses 1 life. So, you know, if you want to, you know, do zombies and aristocrats, it's also a good pickup for that.
And I also, I'll talk about Droskul Captain, very popular and very powerful in any kind of spirit deck. Interesting that it's kind of, it breaks the colors just a little bit, maybe with hexproof, with it being in the Azorius colors. Spirits in general as a tribe, for me, Azorius has kind of been the poster children colors for the spirits tribe. And you know what? It sucks if you kind of get blown out, it gets removed in the middle of a combat step or something like that, but it's just buffing all of your creatures like that and making them hexproof is very, very strong.
Notice that we moved past Emerwolf so quickly because here at CubeCon, I tried to rep the werewolves again.
How did that work out for you,
Randy? And they just asked me, are you going to cut them? Nope, not going to cut them. Going to keep representing them. But unfortunately, the werewolves they just don't seem to be there. They can't compete, and this is my opinion. But in my particular environment, the spirits, the humans, and the zombies, I'd say the only thing the werewolves do cut down a little bit are the vampires because they tend to be smaller and a little bit more scarce. But these other tribes seem to run over a little bit because they have access to blue control, etc.
Werewolves have been kind of underwhelming when it comes to the newer cards. And I feel like spirits have done okay. Zombies have done okay. Humans have always been okay. But the werewolves, it's been surprising to me, and I think that a lot of people would feel the same way, that it does feel very surprising that such an iconic tribe, and not just in Magic, but in, you know, sort of in the sphere of what Magic even exists in, that werewolves are an iconic, you know, creature type, if you will, and yet they just don't seem to have ever had the kind of support that the other tribes have had. Certainly not humans. Spirits have had some really, really good cards printed for them in recent times. But why are werewolves just not getting the same love?
I think it's because of the thematic representation between either daybound or nightbound or the previous, you know.
It's clunky.
Well, it's clunky. It's beautiful, but it's clunky for this environment where I'm putting them. Werewolves by themselves are great, like EDH werewolves. They have time to develop, etc. The problem that I'm experiencing in this cube is the other ones don't make you jump through hoops to get the effect. I mean, you just play Diagraph Captain, and he represents the zombies, buffs them, and there's no timing lapse that has to occur or any special hoops that have to happen. They just straight up get that a value. And even your vanilla 2/2 zombies you got from Giss's bidding, they now turn sideways as a 3/3 zombie. There was no additional effect required.
Yeah, I agree, and I will say I'm not a big fan, and I'm sorry if anyone is, and I don't mean to disrespect your deck or things that you like about this particular mechanic, but I'm really not a big fan of the whole day-night thing. That, like I said, clunky just seems to sum it up so well that there needs to be these, like you say, these conditions for them to either flip and have an effect or any of that kind of stuff. And, again, that might be fine in a really casual environment, and not that this, cards like that can't exist in a casual environment. But this horror cube is definitely more powered up. Those kind of mechanics that are a little bit clunky, they just seem to kind of get overwhelmed pretty quickly, certainly by those other tribes.
I'm going to go against you on this one. I'm a fan of day and night, but it's only based on very particular cards. It's situational. Day night and mechanic, it can be a little hard to track on paper. I think that's been said at this point dozens of times. When it was an arena, the machine did it for you and it was clean. Whereas day night continues to happen for the rest of the game, so you have to track it for the entire game. And so if you reanimate a creature that had that effect on it, you need to pay attention to which one you're in. It can really cause some obstacles in a game aside from that. I like the Werewolves tribe. I continue to push it. I've done everything. I've added at this point, I have Arlen Chords in there that I've tried to add both of them to power max them within their tolerance. I've added Rancor to it. I've done everything I can to try to give them the needed overrun trample type effects to push them forward. It's really hard to manage them when they're fighting against stuff like Intrepid Adversary or Tainted Adversary or Spectral Adversary from the particular, Esper color set. Or, and for that matter, the Bloodthirsty Adversary, which moves us into our adversary section.
All right, so the first adversary we're going to cover is Intrepid Adversary. It's one colorless and one white. It has lifelink. It's a 3/1. And as it enters the battlefield, you may pay one generic and one white any number of times. Or when you pay this cost one or more times, put that many Valor counters on Intrepid Adversary. Creatures you control get +1/+1 for each Valor counter on Intrepid Adversary. This card is just great on its own, but then if you have the extra mana to really buff it up, you can buff your whole team up, and that's great.
I was going to say, I like Intrepid Adversary because it works well early on, right? Even if you just pay 2 mana for it, you're getting a 3/1 with lifelink, so it can immediately represent some pressure. But things that I've spoke about that I'm a real big fan of, and this is a card that I really like because it does act, again, as you said, as a mana sink, right? So you get it early on, represents some good pressure. You get it maybe a little bit later on, and you need to, buff your team a little bit to squeeze through some extra damage, or maybe you've been overwhelmed with a ton of zombies or werewolves or vampires or whatever the case may be, and now you've got some game in the later stages to be able to get your creatures buffed.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this is it appears and looks like the mechanic of a kicker, but it's not. You get to pay the one colorless and one plains, the creature ETBs in, so you don't have to sink the mana in to see if you're getting counter magic played on you. And once it's entered the battlefield, then you can pay this, we're going to call it air quotes, the kicker cost to grow your team with the Valor counters. That's what's interesting about this entire adversary cycle. It doesn't require the additional cost to be paid simultaneously with the casting cost. That's what makes these so powerful. Within this subgroup, and Intrepid Adversary shows up in a lot of vintage cubes, etc., as does the Bloodthirsty Adversary, which I'll skip ahead, and that's the red version of it. It's the vampire that has haste, and when it enters the battlefield, you can exile up that many target instant sorts from your graveyard with value mana 3 or less, and then you can copy them, cast them, and copy them from your graveyard, or without paying their mana cost. So it's interesting. But I've decided to carry this entire suite. For me, this represented we're going to call this the Light Titan cycle within my horror genre environment. I'm in love with the Tainted Adversary, the Spectral Adversary, the Primal Adversary. Actually, this Primal Adversary is one that's a little bit of a strange duck for me as a curator. It's the werewolf that's for 2 colorless and one forest. You get a 4/3 wolf. Trample. When Primal Adversary enters the battlefield, you may pay 1 colorless and 1 forest any number of times. When you pay this cost 1 or more times, put that many 1/1 counters on Primal Adversary, then up to that many target lands you control become a 3/3 wolf creature with haste that are still lands. I'm not in love with the lands becoming wolves versus just giving me some tokens and call it good. Too fond of that one.
Yeah, I would agree. I think for me, I don't want to say in order to make this viable,
And it doesn't untap them.
You read my mind. That's exactly what I was going to say. If it untapped your lands,
it would be sick.
It might even be a little bit too strong. But the fact, like, I don't want to have to sink all my mana into a creature for them to become lands, but they're tapped and I don't get to use them. So how much have I spent? Have I spent 5? Have I spent 7? Have I, heaven forbid, I've spent 9 mana to make all my lands into these 3/3s. And yeah, it's great that they have haste, but they're tapped already. So to me, this is a really, really underwhelming card. Maybe you got a way to untap your lands? Question mark. I don't know. But otherwise, no, I'm not a fan.
Yeah, so now we're going to open this another one from a quote from, and I'll pretense this. It's just because I won't even note the author because we just don't want to support that.
Correct.
But the quote itself is disturbing. I'm going to respect the art, not the artist in this particular statement. And it's the oldest, strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Yes, we acknowledge. Not a nice person. But that quote goes to your bones.
Yes.
Yeah. It does. Okay, so let's talk about, so I've broken down by tribal to give an aspect, and all these will be included in the show notes.
All right, so I'm going to start out talking about Azorius. And these, again, as I mentioned earlier, spirits. For me, Azorius is kind of where spirits are at, right? It's got a ton of really powerful cards in these 2 colors, right? So Patrician Geist is the first one I'll talk about. This is a 2 colorless and 1 blue for a Spirit Knight. It is a 2/2 flyer. It is a lord, gives all other spirits +1/+1. And spirits you cast from your graveyard cost 1 colorless less to cast. I don't know exactly how relevant the third ability is.
It's for the disturbed.
For the disturbed, which is nice, but
not overly supportive.
Not overly, right, exactly. Like, yes, great in, if you've got, dare I say, another format deck that spirits is, but in all, pretty strong card, right? And spirits fly, and flying spirits turning sideways, very, very powerful. Counterspell.
It's a good generic card to represent control.
Exactly. Right?
It's the iconic card.
It is. You want to be controlling things. And obviously, Patrician Geist is only 3 mana, right? If you've been able to get a 1 and a 2 drop out, maybe you've got, quite a bit of a board presence by the time turn 4 comes around. I'm more than happy to kind of sit back and play land go and just, to play my land and swing my creatures and just leave a counter spell up, because typically in a good amount of games, that's going to be enough. And the last one I want to talk about, and this is a big time favorite of mine, is Spell Queller. This is a spirit. It is 1 colorless, 1 white, and 1 blue for a flash flying 2/3 when it enters the battlefield. Exile target spell with converted mana cost 3 or less, and when it leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Obviously, the last line in that is kind of necessary, because if it just exiled and it had flash and you countered something that was on the stack, it would be kind of gross. But overall, I think this is a beautifully balanced card with a ton of power. And this can be, I have ended games with this card and then swung for lethal. So very, very good.
Which brings kind of a counterpoint to what I said before, that I don't want to overly saturate an environment with lords, Anthem lords in particular. But as a curator, how do you overcome the environment where the creatures are just typically smaller power and toughness? I don't care if it's elves. I don't care if it's goblins, merfolk, humans, whatever. A lot of these creatures that, if you order to curve them up, spirits are typically smaller. Yes, they have evasion. So in order to make them make the games not last forever, I'm forced to, as a curator, to inject a few of these +1/+1s. It was almost flavor text to do the reduced casting cost. At the end of the day, this is a 2/2 flyer that buffs my other is the key word, and that's the problem with a lot of these lords. But I need it in order to push the other spirits across the line. The Spectral Processions and the Lingering Souls, they're great as 1/1s, but 2/2s actually quickens the games. It makes it a relevant tribe.
All right, next we're going to go into Boros. We've already talked about the Bloodthirsty Adversary. Again, just a fantastic card. You can get huge value out of that. The next card we're going to talk about there is the Champion of the Parish. And this one is for 1 mana, you get a 1/1. Whenever another human enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on Champion of the Parish. And you want to talk about something that can get out of control quickly? That's that card.
We were talking about the power level of champion of the parish is directly related to the volume of humans in this cube. In this case, I have 63 targets. That includes both your traditional humans along with werewolves and a blend of some of they're gonna become spirit humans. The next card that we're going to talk about, it's just more of because I like Flashback. Flashback is wonderful. And it's Rally the Peasants. And it's basically, it's a combat trick that'll allow you to buff your team. But the Flashback, anything with Flashback, I'm encouraging to do that mechanic in here. I want to do Flashback. I want to try to attempt Delirium someday. Anything that's Graveyards Matters, Graveyard Synergies, I'm really pushing this cube. And in order to give the creatures that are quote unquote not necessarily natural aggro like Champion of the Parish, I want to be able to push it over the edge. I need to add a few combat tricks, etc., to allow them to get over the heap and fight the hordes of the night.
Yeah, interesting point. So we've drafted this a few times. I actually don't think of all the times that I've drafted this cube that I've drafted like a legit humans deck, right?
It's powerful.
I'm sure it is. But let's talk about, let's say, for example, Champion of the Parish, right? Champion of the Parish, if you've got a 4 of, and you've got like a 60 card deck, and you know that 40 of those cards are humans, that can start to get out of hand pretty quickly. I don't know if this is necessarily the case. So I'm asking you this as someone who's played this deck. Has that card, or do cards like that look on the surface like, wow, this could get out of hand really quickly? Do they feel maybe a little bit trappy that you could look at a card like that and think, man, if I get this out really early, it's phenomenal. But if I'm top decking later on, and sure, there's always going to be times where, you get one of your 1-mana creatures and you're like, that's a little bit underwhelming. But do you feel like cards like that can maybe feel a little bit trappy that, on the surface, again, it looks like, wow, that could get out of hand so quickly. But if you get it after the first 3 or 4 turns, maybe it just ain't working out so great, even though it is only 1 mana.
I don't feel like it's more organic than that. This isn't a setup card. This is literally just a 1/1 human for 1 that has built-in payoffs without you. You don't have to try hard to do this. You just need to play Magic the Gathering, and it will build up based on your deck. There's no steps to do here. You just move into your next part of the curve, play a human, and this creature will just organically become larger. That's why I'm in love with this particular creature. No hurdles, no jumping over anything. The one that I did find a struggle with a little bit in this environment was the Champion of the Perished, the zombie version of this particular art. And it's only because of the density of humans, because they have the advantage of going over into the werewolf and some of the going to become spirit tribal sections. The Champion of the Perished tended to get larger when you cross-pollinate into a Selesnya deck because you run werewolves. Whereas the Champion of the Parish is stuck right there with the other zombies, and it becomes kind of vanilla zombie that will get a little larger, but it doesn't grow at the same magnitude in my environment, just based on the quantity of each tribe, because I'm trying to follow that footprint of how I see a zombie horde coming at me. But then I've got these very strategic vampires, and then I have humans that are kind of, they're getting beat down, and they're parsed. They've been parsed out. They've been cut down. So the quantity is lower. Spirits are the flyers, but you have to kill the living to make it's a whole just thought process I put into how I laid out this world building that I'm trying to do with this cube.
All right. So next we're going to talk about Dimir, and this is control, zombies, self-mill. One of the poster children, certainly for any kind of strategy where you're either trying to draw a bunch of cards or mill a bunch of cards, is Labman, good old Laboratory Maniac, which is pretty straightforward. 3 mana for a 2/2 human wizard, 2 colorless and 1 blue. And it has the wonderful benefit of, if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you will win the game instead. Obviously pairs fantastic with cards like Undead Butler, Forgotten Creation,
Armored Scab,
yeah. So any strategy or any card that allows you to just dump cards into your graveyard from your library via mill, or that you're just being able to draw a bunch of cards. Personally, I prefer drawing cards than just straight up milling them, but obviously you're working towards the same strategy. We talked about Diagraph Captain, zombies, it's blue-black, it gives your other zombies +1/+1, it has Death Touch, which I really, really like Death Touch on Dimir. I find that it gives that little element of like, should I, shouldn't I, for your opponent when they're thinking about whether or not they should swing in.
In addition to help that type of idea, we've got cards like Thought Scour, which is your non-traditional draw where you're going to have. And so this is what's interesting. I don't support mill. We're gonna call it, I'm not pushing mill, I'm pushing self-mill, but that's not to say that you can't mill someone out. Here at CubeCon, this happened to me yesterday, and it was actually kind of amazing. The opponent that I was playing against that we drafted our cube had exhausted their resources, their capabilities of beating with win cons, and it was so funny to sit in that draft and hear them say, well, we're moving on to our other win con. How many cards you got left in your deck? And, normally I'm not a huge proponent of mill, but this brought me joy because the individual who's playing against me had tried so hard to beat me with all of these traditional strategies, wasn't trying to do this. But Plan B has now happened in the Horror Cube, which is awesome. And they switched over to doing like Droff's Mind Crusher. And it died multiple times, so I had to mill 5 cards. And the Undying trigger came on, and I had to mill 5 cards again. And as I said, they actually just...
Yeah, I don't know if that was me, but I built a deck that was designed to mill my opponents. I didn't quite have the pieces that I need, but it's not everybody's cup of tea, right? Making your opponents put cards from their library into their graveyard, or even forcing your opponents to draw cards. Nephalia Drownyard, though, I think is a really good addition to this cube and to that archetype. This is a land that allows you to pay 1 colorless, 1 blue, 1 black, and you tap it to make target player mill 4 cards. You can do it to yourself if you're trying to win with Labman. You can do it to your opponent if you're trying to make them mill out. Again, like you said, this is more self-mill than opponent mill. But either way, strategies like that, I really do find them to be something that you have to commit to. And there's cards that you'll look at, like Armored Scarab is a great example of that, right? It's an okay card, but it's really only good in that strategy. Jace Wielder of Mysteries, okay, it's a good Planeswalker and it has other utility out of, just like the Labman effect. Even Labman himself, it's 3 mana for a 2/2 that doesn't do anything else except win you the game when you draw a card with no cards in your library. So by themselves, they're really not great, and you do have to have a lot of dense pieces to make strategies like that work. But it's something cool and it's something fun, and I like that you have additions like that, these kind of archetypes in your...
And I like it, so it actually rolls right over into the Golgari section, which is going to be the Reanimator mid-range. But the Labman particular environment, the self-mills, the spider spawnings, I support all those in there. But one of my favorite cards for the Labman thing is actually Necromancy. And that's, it's for 2 colorless and 1 black, you get an enchantment. You may choose to play Necromancy as an instant. If you do, bury it at the end of turn. That's as far as I'm going to read this. Otherwise, it's going to bring the creature back. But what's neat is you can actually flash this in to protect your Labman. They think they've got you. They think they've broken down your strategy. They have killed your Labman. Let it sit in your graveyard. All hope is lost. And then wait for it. And snap that Necromancy in there and get that card back in that game. It's a gotcha. It's a fun gotcha, but it has been done. I enjoy that very much. All right, and so the card that I'm going to use to tie off this is the signpost that represents in this particular horror genre environment is going to be Lotleth Troll. And for one swamp and 1 forest, you get a zombie troll. It's a 2/1, trample. Discard a creature card, put a +1/+1 counter on Lotleth Troll. And it has basically pay 1 swamp, regenerate Lotleth Troll. What I like about this is it actually feeds into these Reanimator strategies, but it also gets big on its own. I mean, this card's fantastic. It regenerates become replaced by indestructible and every other effect. What is it now? Shield.
Oh, the shield counter.
It's the shield, right? But this particular troll can beat you to death. I love it. This trample effect. This is a very powerful card. That kind of wraps up the Golgari section. The next we're going to go over, and this is my... I have a strong fondness for the Werewolves mid-range package, and it is currently represented by Tovalar, the Dire Overlord. And I thought he was going to be the savior of the Werewolves. The Werewolves are still struggling. It's a very mid-range deck. The problem is the pieces in an 8-person draft are having a hard time coming together. It's probably maybe the way I'm curating my cube, I will actually own that idea. I'm trying to improve upon it, but I have saturated at this point. I've added both Arlens, Halpak Piper, and I've got every single wolf that you can pretty much put into this cube to try to push this thing. I want to see this be a highly successful tribal group.
Right.
It just seems to struggle for some reason, but I'm going to continue to try to pursue it, and I want to build upon it. I think it's essential, actually. They're the only tribe with this entire cube that actually has some relevant power and toughness, and that may be what's hurting them because the others are they're more aggro in their sense. The casting costs are more efficient. They have evasion, spirits, vampires, humans, and they're quicker. This represents my mid-range threat, so I've been working as curator count to balance this idea to make this to kind of take down the power levels of the smaller groups that are overtaking the environment. What are your thoughts, Stu?
So I suppose my first question is, right, you're obviously, this is a theme. This is a tribe, right? It's werewolves. They fit the theme perfectly. But at least from what I'm gathering, certainly from the times that you've play tested it and the times that other people in our group have play tested it, it does just seem to lack the punch a little bit that the other tribes do, right?
Yeah.
Not only that, but I feel that the utility that the colours offer might be a little underwhelming compared to the utility that the colours offer in like Azorius, for example.
I would agree.
Where you've got the counter magic, where you've got black, where you might have, removal spells, for example, et cetera, right? So as a curator, now the question becomes, and obviously I speak of this from a player to a curator perspective, right? So you don't want to just add cards willy-nilly in those colours in order to bump them up a little bit, right? Because then they become dead cards. If, say, for example, we're drafting it as 4 players, and yes, you want to obviously optimize the cube for when it's been drafted by 8 players. You don't always get that. But do you ever feel like there's a bit of a danger there? Like, man, imagine if I just had something that would grant the werewolves that little bit of an extra punch, right? It's not a card that's really going to see any use outside of when someone's drafting it. It could be some enchantments. It could be whatever the case may be, it doesn't really matter. Maybe planeswalkers, right? But where do you find that balance as a curator from trying to stay on theme? And I think this is a great discussion for this, and not just this cube, but other cubes. But when you do find an archetype, a tribe or whatever that seems to be just a little bit underwhelming compared to the other tribes, and you want to give it that little bit of a punch, but you don't want to go off theme.
Yeah, so I don't like breaking theme, but sometimes I've had to acknowledge the fact that breaking theme is a necessity in order to make something function in this tribal environment.
Because you're not going to take werewolves out, right? There's no way you're going to take werewolves out of this cube. They just fit the theme so well. So now it becomes, there's no way, right? That question of, well, would you consider taking werewolves out from this cube is like, absolutely not. There are fundamental aspects of this cube. They fit the theme perfectly. So where do you go?
So then I transition over to cards that still fall within that. I look for particular arts, like Curse of Predation, for example. It's for 2 colorless and 1 forest. You get an enchantment or a curse. You enchant a player, so you put this on your opponent. Whenever a creature attacks enchanted player, put a 1/1 counter on it. This actually creates relevance to something, say, like Emberwolf. There was a 2/2 with Intimidate that gave your other wolves a buff. Now, when you attack with that and it connects, it becomes a 3/3 and so on and so forth. It encourages you to move into combat and not make these mid-range defensive walls to try to shut down the zombie horde or the vampires that are overtaking you with their haste, etc. All right, so a card that I've used to actually try to fortify the Gruul section, which will be the werewolves, and I'll even give this to Selesnya humans, if you will. It's going to be the Glorious Sunrise. And for 3 colorless and 2 forests, you get an enchantment. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose one. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample until end of turn. Now, that's actually been a big benefit to any of those just standard 2/2 wolf tokens that I get generation from some of the cards within this environment. And then we've got target land has tap, add 3 forest or 3 green until end of turn, or actually all of these are included, pardon me. Draw a card, and if you control a creature with power 3 or greater, and you gain 3 life. So you get to choose one of those out of this like menu of options. Traditionally with the werewolves, I'm either going to choose the ramp or I'm going to choose the +1/+1. I know draw has value here, but it's conditional on one of this creature being larger. I move past that, but I'm in love with this card. This card is actually a beater, and it actually gives relevance to the werewolf tribe. But unfortunately for the werewolves, they do require the rancors, the cursed predations, and these type of effects to carry them over the finish line, because a lot of them traditionally don't have a lot of evasion, at least in my environment. And I'm speaking particularly to the tokens they produce. There's not a lot of lords that give +1/+1s outside of the Emerwolf and a couple of others, whereas the spirits and the zombies and the vampires are highly supported in these Anthem lords. It's been a real struggle for this tribe, so I have to add other things a little bit outside of the normal spectrum that I'd want to do within this horror genre to make them better. So I do have to break some of my rules as a curator, else they'll never be good.
Also, I would ask this as well. Obviously, yeah, you've put a card in like this. Well, I'll ask that question first. Did you put this card in? Was this an addition after the original iteration of the cube where you decided I need to give a buff to Gruul, right, to my werewolves, so I'm going to add cards like this to give them that little bit of a bump? Was that the case, for example, with this card?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They were just it was too many times they were getting the short end of the stick. And then I'm a symmetrical builder. I just fall in that trap. I want all of my guilds to be equal, and I like doing singleton. This is the first time I've ever actually broken that idea, and I started overly supporting Gruul, and I've doubled down, and I have multiple, like I said before, multiple Arlens. I have Tovalar, etc., Emerwolf, and I'm running more in that particular guild section than the other guild section, just because no matter what I was doing, they were bleeding out. They could not compete with the other lords and the other sections, the other tribes in this cube environment.
So now we've got this enchantment that you've brought in, right? It's in green. But it doesn't just fit with the werewolves, does it?
It helps the humans again.
It certainly does. So now, I mean, and again, I'm asking you this from a player to a curator. How do you sort of evaluate post-change, right? Post that you've added this card, it's now been added for the purpose of buffing up those werewolves because they're just not getting the job done. But now you've added this card that, you know, by itself is okay, is pretty strong, but you couple it with an already really powerful clan, another powerful tribe like humans, and suddenly you might have just taken that from being a pretty balanced, and then you've got, you know, your werewolves player and your humans player that are thinking, man, if we could draft equally, but whoever gets that one card, if the werewolves player doesn't get it, well, they're just not going to get the job done. But if the humans player does, their tribe is out of control.
Which comes back to the fundamental problem with the werewolves is that they're initially humans. I mean, there's no way out here. I drafted a deck. You can comfortably draft a humans deck in this environment, and then they flop over and become werewolves. And it stays on theme. So I don't know if it's so much a problem. It's a singular card. It can get broken 1,000 different ways. There's ways to answer it in here. But in order for you to want to try to drive into drafting a lot of werewolves, I need to encourage it. And I've put a suite of tools out there, and I'll say Rancor, for an example. Yes, unfortunately, humans and vampires and spirits can also wear Rancor. I wish I could put a note on there that says, this is for werewolves exclusively. I just haven't seen any of those players actually be interested in Rancor. Because the colors, I do support all of the duels and fetches, et cetera, in here that are themed out. But I've just noticed these play lines where people tend to build two-color decks. If they're in spirits, they're in blue-white. It just seems to be the way. If they're in Rakdos, they're in vampires, right? It's like Selesnya is humans, Gruul is werewolves. I've just watched this too many times. It's not to say people can't break it. It just doesn't seem like it's happened yet. I guess that's why I've gotten away with running a card like Rancor and watching it only attached to the occasional human, but mostly werewolves.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I try to understand that perspective and understand that from a curator's point of view, you're not trying to, you know, overpower one to compensate another. And similarly, you're not trying to gut one of the other tribes in order to just try and make one of the tribes relevant, right? You wouldn't just go through and say, hey, I'm going to remove some of the fun, you know, because we want the cubes to be fun. But you don't want to take away some of the fun cards that might be really powerful, like we talk about the Machias, right? Both those Machias cards are really strong. Those aren't individually pushing over zombies or whatever else to be much more powerful than werewolves, and it's a bit of a combination of all things. But again, when you're trying to add these cards to give that tribe a little bit of a boost, and you're also running the risk of it just increasing the power level on the others. And then I'll go all the way back to, what about the breaking from the theme, right? How deep into that can you go in order to give the relevancy to that tribe?
All right, so the next section we're going to move over to is going to be our Is It section. And it's going to be a spells matters, but it's also going to emphasize flashback within this particular environment. So Wandering Mind is going to be the first card we're going to cover that's going to represent this particular tribe, represent this guild. And it's going to be a Flying Horror 2/1. And for one colorless and one island, one mountain, you get a creature horror, flying. When Wandering Mind enters the battlefield, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. I love any card that allows me to do any kind of deck manipulation, sifting, trying to find my answers. I know this isn't instant speed, but I am a huge fan of this card when it came out. I thought it was beautiful. This card just really supports the Spells Matters particular section.
All right, so the last one we're going to talk about is Fevered Visions. This is a pet card of Anthony's, and I will say I'm a huge fan of it as well. This is a 1 colorless, 1 blue, 1 red enchantment. At the beginning of each player's end step, that player draws a card. If the player is your opponent and has 4 or more cards in hand, Fevered Visions deals 2 damage to them. Yeah, like 2 damage just for drawing a card. I'll take that.
And it's great in the 2-headed giant environment. I have to say that. It's amazing.
Yeah, and again, we're at CubeCon, and the 2-headed giant cube has come out, and I do hope we get to draft that again. All right, next one we're going to talk about is Aristocrats. Anthony, I know this is a big pet of yours, so I think you should be the one to take this one.
All right, so the next section, like Stu said, is going to be the Rakdos section. It's going to be the Aristocrats burn section. it's going to be my favorite section. I love this both in peasant cubes. I like to get in this pauper cubes, and I definitely love me some blood artist in this particular environment. And what you get is a 0/1 vampire. Not so great, I admit that. But it's not about that with aristocrats. It's whenever blood artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. But even better, we get his older, cooler flying brother, Falconwrath Noble. This has all the effects we just named, but it's a flyer for a 2/2. I love this card. However, we're going to go into the next card, and it's going to be this art. This art is bonkers. And it is Spiteful Prankster. And you get yourself a devil. It's a 3/2. And whenever another creature dies, Spiteful Prankster deals 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. And as long as your turn, Spiteful Prankster gets a first strike. He is literally lighting a dove on fire and pitching them from the top of the buildings. We have talked about this during our Aristocrats episode that we covered. I get to run Aristocrats on theme with this Cube environment. Absolutely love me some Aristocrats.
I find that more terrifying. I find this more terrifying, that art like that, than like the crazy zombies and the crazy zombies and all that kind of stuff. Like that to me is even more frightening than some of the other cards. But yeah, super.
The next section we're going to cover is the Orzhov section. It's going to be your control, and we're going to support some tribal, mostly vampires in this section, and some humans. But it's going to be the Wrath of God and the Cruel Celebrants. And in this case, one of my favorites is going to be Sorin, Lord of Innistrad. And for 2 colors and 1 plains and 1 swamp, you get a Planeswalker Sorin. This starts out with 3 loyalty. Its +1 is put a 1/1 black vampire creature with lifelink onto the battlefield. His -2 is you get an emblem with creatures you control, get +1/+0. That actually is the section that I use mostly in order to drive these vampires, humans, etc. over the line. I love that card. It's an anthem that you can protect on a Planeswalker. In this particular case, it's actually outgrown my Powered Vintage Cube. But as we talked about in our previous episode, whenever we did the Walk the Plank, when cards like this fall out of favor in my cubes, I move them over to another environment and give them a chance to take off from there.
So I'm going to lay down the law a little bit with Sorin. This is my own personal feelings. I'm really starting to like Sorin less and less and less the more that I play with it. I agree with you that I do play this in another deck in the format that won't be mentioned. And the +1 is okay. I get a 1/1 vampire, but I've just spent 4 mana to get a 1/1 vampire. So I'm not really in love with that effect. The -2, that's okay, but it's not +1/+1 even. It's +1/+0. And I'm not really a huge fan of that. Like, I feel like I've just spent a lot of mana. I can get Lords for 2 and 3 mana that give +1/+1 and even another effect as well. What does this have going for it? It's a Planeswalker, right? So, yeah, I can do a -2 on it, and now I'm forcing my opponent to either spend, a combat step with a creature or 2 trying to get rid of it. The ultimate is okay. But I'm not in love with this card. I don't dislike the effects. I think building a board presence and buffing your board presence is never a bad thing. But this individually as a card, I'm starting to like less and less.
I agree with you. I'm just looking for a new cut to actually add in that space. It's not just straight up Orzhov removal or some strange utility spell. I want something on flavor, on point. I am also not a huge fan of this in this particular environment, but it does fill a very utilitarian role. I feel like there's other Sorins, but they actually cost a little bit more on the mana curve. I'll be looking for other options in the future. It's hard to make upgrades to this cube.
Yeah, and I suppose again from a power level perspective, right? This is a quite powerful cube, right? It's not vintage power level, but it's fairly powerful. Speed of how fast the decks are trying to win is always going to be a consideration when you're designing, certainly the entire cube, but also when you think about these individual tribes, how quickly are you trying to get these tribes to win, right? Vampires, I've mentioned this in the other format and the other deck that I've tried to kind of slow it down and not just flood the board and play some more of these, higher CMC but high value creatures, similarly to how you've got like the Machiases, for example, right? They're not just like crazy beaters that you're trying to get down. They've got some utility to them. And that with vampires, I think kind of goes the antithesis of that in sort of the more common ways of playing vampires, which is just to flood the board, right? Get them on the board, get them turning sideways. And then you've got the option. Do you want to buff them? Do you want to just add something to the board? If you are trying to play that bit more of a control-y black-white, or are you trying to play a bit more of an aggro black-white? So as much as I'm not crazy about it, I do like the fact that you've got a little bit of a decision to make there and you can sort of customize your choice based on how you're trying to.
And it does work a little bit as, I said this before, a little bit of an active fog for the board.
Yeah.
It creates a distraction.
Planeswalkers are like a big boogeyman. Anytime they're on the board.
It's popping smoke. You want to draw attention away from what you're trying to do? do?
Yep.
Play a Planeswalker. It's an active fog.
Yeah.
Until it's dead. Works in Commander, works that way in Cube. It's just my opinion. I jumped over a Jace Beller another day and just said, nah, I don't care. Draw cards. I'm going to hit your life total. It didn't work.
He still lost.
Probably should have killed Jace Bellerin, folks. Hot take. But the next section is the Selesnya section. And I'm only going to cover 2 cards for this one because I've done some cuts since. The next card we're going to talk about is going to be Tauren, Fist of Angels. It is a legendary creature, human cleric, 2/2. Training. Whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 green and white human soldier creature token with training. This card's actually been pretty effective. It's on theme. It's helping those humans that needed so much help. They don't need any help. But Selesnya is actually a lot more strong and a lot more represented in this particular environment opposed to a lot of my other environments. This card has actually been fantastic, and it's on theme. The next card that we're going to cover, and this one's an oldie but a goodie, the reason why I run Strip Mine and other effects like that, Field of Ruin, is going to be Gavany Township. This card's a house, and what it does is tap, add for colorless. It's a land. Or you can pay 2 and 1 forest and 1 plains, tap, put a 1 counter on each creature you control. This card is amazing in this cube, and it can get out of control, really buffs those Selesnya humans. I'm in love with this card. Here's the next section we're going to talk about. This is where it gets really weird. I'll kind of just breeze over these. These cards get a little... It's the Simic. So the thing that I've had the most difficulty curating a boo-scary environment, if you will, and I know that these are pseudo-scary, but it's going to be... The creatures are just strange. The other one is actually it's Suspicious Stowaway. And it's the new werewolf again. And it's on a boat, which is confusing all by itself. It's on a boat. But yeah, so for 1 colorless and 1 blue, you get a human rogue werewolf. Suspicious Stowaway can't be blocked. Whenever Suspicious Stowaway deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, then discard a card. And that's his daybound, so it introduces that mechanic. The other side of it flips over, it becomes a 2/1, and it actually just draws you a card as a werewolf. It's the only one that actually in this particular environment that I think truly represents what I'm trying to do with this. It's just oddly outside of the spectrum of what werewolves traditionally are. I get a little weirder. This has been the hardest one. It's going to be the root coil creepers and the slow gurks of the overslime. So I'm asking wizards to get me some vampires on a boat. Get me some zombies on a boat. Because I kind of want to get rid of these odd ducks that are in this cube. It's the filler. I even got that one flashback card that looks like he's got a duck face on it. I don't know what's going on. It turns into a frog. It turns into a frog. Yeah, it's such an odd card. Yeah, I really this is my weirdest section. And I think it's kind of the weird section. I think it embraces that idea. It just looks really strange inside this cube when I start going into, I'm a horror genre, but I'm turning your dude into a frog with a hat on. It's just, I don't know. I'm not in love with it. What do you think?
I mean, you're turning something into a frog, which I would expect a witch to do. And witches is kind of horror. Or am I thinking about, the Wicked Witch of the West? And I'm thinking about Dorothy. And now I'm not really thinking about horror and Lovecraft. I'm thinking about Disney and Fantasia. And when am I going to watch WALL-E? So, I don't know. I would agree. It's kind of weird. It's a weird card, right, for a cube like this, because you are trying to keep it scary. You're trying to keep all the themes in, but you're trying to add that support for, and Simic it's green and blue. Where's the horror in green or blue typically, right? You've got, and it's not that it doesn't exist, but again, you've got to try and fit it in with the tribes and fit it in with the themes and that kind of stuff. And I can only imagine that this was a difficult color pairing to work with when it came to this. And look, sometimes you just got to work with what you can.
Yes, you have to paint with the colors that you're provided. So that kind of wraps up the overview of the Horror Cube. And this is our CubeCon 2022 Halloween special is what we'll refer to this as. And what I wanted to talk about is kind of the tribal synergies and how you can take these, and I'll have all this in the show notes. So you can make humans and werewolves and vampires and spirits and zombies, and they can all hang out and play together and crush your foes together. The other thing, too, is kind of the thematic design, the viewpoint of doing a top-down design, coming up with an idea and then focusing on the idea and building the entire world build from the top, not from letting the cards drive it. Let your vision drive it and then find the cards that fit your vision. The last one is you want to make this immersive. If you're going to do a horror genre, I really try to stick to things that are, as we said, scary. So when something starts making a frog, I start having a problem with it, right? I mean, frogs are scary, but they're only so scary. Or I have a problem with Rancor. I'm not in love with the art that I have chosen. It's scary, but it's scary in the environment which it hosts, but it's not gothic horror scary. But I need it in order to promote this type of environment. So I'm looking for cards and art that really fall in with that, but I do have to make some concessions. That's something you learn to do, else the environment, in my case, is going to fail. Why support the werewolves if I'm not going to try to find means to make them better?
You're absolutely right. And I will say this, when I first, you said, hey, we're going to draft this horror cube, right? We get together Friday night, hey, let's draft a horror cube. And when I read it and I read the themes and I read what the cube is about, the first thing I'm thinking of, right, is that this sounds amazing. We're going to sit down with some people and you're going to get people playing zombies and people playing werewolves and people playing humans and people playing spirits, right? So you've got this like four corners almost, and not that necessarily they have to represent that, but you can kind of, immerse yourself in that kind of environment, right? Where you've got four people and they're all playing these different tribes and they've all got different things going on. And, again, from the theme perspective, trying to match all the power levels and trying to make sure that there's an identity between them is really cool. This is I don't want to say it's my favorite cube of yours, but it might be my favorite of yours, even though I think it's a more straightforward. I know Anthony's kind of looking at me like, what? Are you serious? But it might be my favorite from a flavor perspective, right? I enjoy playing it. I enjoy playing all the cubes, but I think from a flavor, and I think just, the horror is a thing that I'm interested in as well, right? I love horror movies and that kind of stuff. So I think from a theme perspective, I really enjoy playing it. And I think from just, a play design perspective, it's got to be something that has, it gets the blood flowing as a group when you're sitting down, because you've got that possibility to like, I'm going to be a human and I'm going to get that battle axe out and I'm going to go slay spirits and slay werewolves and so yeah, super fun and enjoyable. And please, wizards, give us some good werewolves
and some vampires that are on a boat. All right. So closing quote: monsters are real. Ghosts are real too. They live inside us, and sometimes they win. Stephen King. All right. Other than that, Stu is going to take us out to the socials.
All right, guys, thank you very much for listening. As always, again, we are coming to you guys. We're recording this from Madison, Wisconsin, where we have been at CubeCon. I want to give a big shout out to all the people that have been involved with putting on the CubeCon for us. Cultic Cube, Justin Parnell, Jonathan Brostaff. I'm not going to go through everybody's names, but all the people that were involved in putting on CubeCon. It's been an incredible experience. We cannot thank you guys enough. And for anyone who's listening and wasn't able to join, I would really hope that we see you guys next time there's another CubeCon. If it's next year here in Madison, Wisconsin, I would love to think that the CubeCon guys will be out here representing, and we'd love to come and hang out. And if you see us around, then come see what we're doing. And if we're about to start up a draft, then come by and feel free to join us. It's been super fun to meet all of the community and just pull people in and draft. And again, cannot thank the people who've the organizers of this enough. Again, if you've enjoyed listening to this show, whatever your chosen podcast program is, please. We'd love to hear from you, and give us a 5-star review. It really helps. Drop a comment, let us know how you feel. But those 5-star reviews really do go a long way with getting the exposure out there. And we want to get out there to as many cubers as possible, and maybe just Magic people, in the hope that we can bring people over away from some of those other formats and get them involved in this cube format as much as possible. You can find us on Twitter. We are at UberCubeMTGPod. You can also reach us via email. We are UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. And we have a Discord. And again, I've said this on a few occasions, but we get some great conversation going on the Discord about our podcast, or about cubes, about card choices. It's a great way to interact with not just us, but other people within the community. Get some feedback on your cube or other cubes or whatever the case may be. So we've got a link in our Twitter profile. So come by, check us out, and say hi.
All right, and the other thing we're going to cover is actually the Patreon at UberCube. It's a great way. It's a landing site on here you can check out. It has a lot of menus and suites, and what it does is it's tailored to actually add immersive interaction for our listeners. Check it out, see what you think. We'd love to have some feedback on it. We're just trying to grow this community, and we're going to now say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is Happy Cubing!